So good evening. Thank you for coming here. My name is Evan Weiner. My background is television and radio, mostly radio. Also newspapers and magazines, obviously speaking. I started at the age of 15 in Rockland County at Spring Valley High School. I did a show called Tiger Talk that was on WRKL radio. In 1978, I was with WGRC radio. I had graduated college a year early. I was 21 years old. I was assigned to cover the New York State Democratic fundraiser in Nyack, New York. And that's where John Lindsay told me he was running for Senate in 1980. And because of that, I ended up on WNEW radio with Guillermo B. Gomez and Scott Muni on the FM. And I did 3.5 years of doing news work starting at the age of 21 on WNEW radio. This talk actually started as somebody called me from the Larchmont Library, Paul Doherty, and he said, we're doing a 1960s retrospective at the library throughout the month of April, and we understand you have a radio and TV background, and we would like for you to talk about 1968, which probably was the most archaic year in the 60s, although 1969 globally would give it a run for the money and actually would surpass it. But in the United States, at least, it was very chaotic. And so what you see there is Barbara Walters, who was on the Today shows at that time. And she's showing off a new 1968 Westinghouse TV, complete with the vertical hold and a horizontal hold in the front. And the dial, and I don't see rabbit ears on that one, but I'm sure you all remember rabbit ears. And there's Barbara Walters in front of her 1968, or the Westinghouse 1968 TV that she's trying to sell on the Today Show, where she was the co-host with Hugh Downs. So 1968 starts, and I got a good question of the year was this: who was the better Catwoman? Was it Julie Newmar on the show Batman? They're talking to Adam West. Was she the better Catwoman? Or was Eartha Kitt the better Catwoman? Now, you might be saying, why am I talking about Batman? But there is a method to the madness. The war in Vietnam continues. At this point, the war in Vietnam, it has been, at this point, 3.5 years since Lyndon Johnson signed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution into war. Congress gave him into legislation, into law. It was here that Congress gives him the ultimate authority to decide what's going on in Vietnam, and Johnson would escalate the war. Lady Bird Johnson is having a luncheon for very successful women at the White House. One of them is Eartha Kitt, who is playing a Catwoman on Batman at this point. And she is asking the question to Lyndon Johnson's wife, President Lyndon Johnson's wife, face to face. Why are the boys still in Vietnam? It turned out to be career suicide for Eartha Kitt in the United States asking that question, because Lady Bird told Lyndon, and Lyndon called all his friends up in the entertainment industry to blackball Eartha Kitt. She had to go to Europe for a while to continue her career going. But it was the first time somebody actually went into the White House and asked a member of the Johnson family, why are we, the United States, still in Vietnam? Why had we been there since 1964? Why did we have advisors there, some of whom were killed in 1963? Why were we there when the French deserted Vietnam in 1954? Meanwhile, as Eartha Kitt is asking Lady Bird Johnson, why are the boys, and I should add girls, because there were women who were part of the armed forces that served in Vietnam. While this is going on, across the mall is the Jeannette Rankin Peace Parade. Jeannette Rankin had been elected to the Congress in 1916 from Montana. And she drew all these women to Washington on a cold day, and you can see the snow is out there. And it's welcome to the Jeannette Rankin Peace Parade. End the war in Vietnam and social crisis at home. The social crisis at home, the civil rights movement that is still ongoing, despite the fact that Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in July of 1964. Jeanette Rankin was 87 years old in 1968, and this is January 19th. And she had been a congresswoman on and off from Montana since 1917, so 51 years later. She had voted against the United States participation in World War I and World War II, and she gets 5,000 women to march in Washington. And there was one other aspect to this protest. Sisterhood is powerful. You got to remember, there is the Martin Luther King civil rights movement that's going on, but there's also another civil rights movement that's going on as well, which was started maybe accidentally by Betty Friedan in 1963 when she wrote her book, The Feminine Mystique. By 1966, the National Organization of Women was founded, and the women's rights movement begins in the mid-1960s. On January 23rd, 1968, North Korea. By the way, if I was with you today, I would ask you this question. Is the war between the United States and North Korea over? The answer is it's not. There was a truce signed in 1953, and I'm not even sure it was a war. It was a military action on behalf of the United States against North Korea. But North Korea seized the SS Pueblo, USS Pueblo. Lloyd Booker was the admiral, the commander of that ship. And North Korea claimed the ship violated its territorial waters because it was spying on North Korea. This is another problem Lyndon Johnson has to face. The ship is still in North Korea. It's a museum. The men were released about a year later when Richard Nixon took office. The Viet Cong on January 30th launched the Tet Offensive against South Vietnam. Now, Richard Nixon was looking at the results of the Tet Offensive, and he thought, we won. It's not going to be. It's not going to be a campaign issue. The Viet Cong did not win the Tet Offensive on the ground, but they won it public relations-wise. The next day, the Viet Cong soldiers attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It was a very bloody battle for the Viet Cong, but somehow that loss turned into a propaganda win. And Nixon was absolutely sure that it would be over. It would definitely be over. There wouldn't be anything because North Vietnam would surrender. It didn't happen that way. Also, around this time, an old war reporter who I met twice in my life, and we never talked about news the two times that we met and spoke, an old war reporter from World War II, he was with UPI at the time before joining CBS, old Iron Pants, Walter Cronkite, by now the most trusted man in America because he told Americans that John Kennedy was dead on November 22nd, 1963, reads it, takes down the glasses, sheds a tear, composes himself, puts the glasses back on, old Iron Pants is back in the saddle, and with that, he becomes the most trusted man in America. He's in Vietnam, and he is looking to see whether or not the Americans could win the Vietnam War. He would make his decision, or you would hear his decision or his verdict on February 27th, about a month after the Tet Offensive. By early 1968, February, only 35% of Americans approved Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war. Now, the Vietnam War, and some of you in this room will remember, some of you might be protesters, some of you have the psychedelic thing up with the peace sign as well. The Vietnam War was the first war ever to be played out on television. Obviously, there was some TV during World War II, but very few people had it, and TV was only on at that point, maybe 15 hours a week, during that war. And NBC wanted to cover the Korean War on the John Cameron Swayze newscast, but it was sponsored by R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. And they had final say over the NBC News, and they said, you're not going to talk about the Korean War for whatever reason that they had. But Vietnam, you could see things going on in Vietnam on a daily basis, and there was something called body count at dawn. How many Americans were killed? How many Americans wounded? How many Americans missing in action? How many VC, the Viet Cong, killed, how many wounded, how many missing in action, how many allies killed, how many allies who were wounded. So we were getting snippets of this war on a daily basis. And that's the first time in television history that you actually saw what was going on to an extent in Vietnam. Cronkite's report would air on February 27th, but got to get to earlier in the month before February 27th. These are the Smothers Brothers. The Smothers Brothers, their design, or the design in hiring them by William Paley, the chairman of the board from CBS, who founded CBS with a radio station in Philadelphia, WCAU. He was looking at his programming and he sees his favorite show, Gunsmoke, where Miss Kitty is now, well, she's old lady Kitty, right? The show had been on forever. And he sees an old Red Skelton and he sees an old Ed Sullivan who's bringing on the Doors and other musical acts, hoping to get young people in. And he sees a bunch of rural shows, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies. By the way, the Petticoat Junction, you might not realize this, but Petticoat Junction was a show that was the first show that actually featured a woman who was the head of the house, Kate Bradley, because she ran the hotel business. She was the breadwinner. So don't dismiss Petticoat Junction out of hand. It did have some significance. So, and Mayberry, RFD, and there were old people on CBS, and they had an old audience. They were looking for young people, and they had the Smothers Brothers on a show in 1963. They refined their act, and they're young guys, like 30 and 28. And CBS decides, let's roll the dice against Bonanza. Let's put them on after the Sullivan Show. They're good, clean, young kids. It'll be great. But they didn't realize that Tommy Smothers did not like the war in Vietnam. And the show was directed at skewering Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. They hired some writers. I don't know if you've ever heard of these writers. I'll go through them. And one of the writers used to be on the show, and he put bow and arrow through his head and played the banjo. I don't know if you remember him or not, because to me, he's kind of obscure. Steve Martin, you ever hear of Steve Martin? He was one of the writers on the show. And then there was another guy. His father was pretty famous in television because he was involved with Imogene Coca and Carl Reiner in the Show of Shows and Dick Van Dyke. So he has this kid, and this kid goes on to a TV career after the Smothers Brothers. He's on a show where he plays, I think, a character named Meathead on All in the Family. You ever hear of Rob Reiner? Rob Reiner. And they have David Steinberg, and they have Mason Williams. Classical Gas was his big hit in the recording industry, and Mason Williams and Pat Paulson is on the show, and they have a whole bunch of people, Lee French, and all of them are young, and all of them have the same mental outlook: get out of Vietnam. And that's causing William Paley some problems, so much so that he begins to talk to Tommy Smothers, and not in an endearing way. There was another show also that was on that was for anti-war protesters as well, sort of. Rowan and Martin's Laughing, although John Wayne would appear on the show, and so would Richard Nixon on the show in 1968. But they too had a lot of anti-war jokes. Also in February of that year, Tommy Smothers decides, you know what, I'm going to get Pete Seeger on the air. Now, Pete Seeger had been blacklisted, as you might remember, communist, did a lot on the Hudson River, obviously, over the years. But he is coming back into mainstream society, and Tommy Smothers wants to tap into that, and he decides that he's going to have Pete on the show. And he tells William Paley, I'm having Pete on the show, and William Paley says, no, no, no. And Tommy said, have you seen our ratings? Have you seen what we're doing? We are doing what you wanted. We're bringing in people under the age of 35, college graduates, making money, disposable income, young families, everything that you want for the advertisers we're bringing in. So we want Pete Seeger. And Paley says reluctantly, oh, okay, you can have him on. But he can't sing a song that he's singing right now. The song, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. Seeger performs it on February 25th, 1968. The song was considered symbolic of the Vietnam War, and Johnson's policy of escalation, then widely seen as pushing the United States deeper into an increasingly unpopular war. Well, they hit 500,000 troops, the United States, in 1968. So we're in really deep. And the song is about, hey, we're in really deep. We're in this mud. Which way do we go? Seeger performs it on February 25th of that year. Now, there was a remarkable one-week run of The Tonight Show, early February. Johnny is off for the week, and Johnny is taking a look at what is going on with the country, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, but he's a comedian, and he does not want to be political. In fact, maybe the most political he was in his career was when he said we couldn't get toilet paper, and there was a rush in his store to get toilet paper, and then there was a rush around the country, it's about 73, 74, to get toilet paper off the shelves. That was all he did. But he was a little concerned about what was going on, and he asked Harry Belafonte to sit in for the week. And it was a remarkable week. PBS just did something on this week that Harry Belafonte was on. Among his guests, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., seen there, Paul Newman on this show, and there's Ed McMahon, here's Harry, on the show. And it was February 5th through 9th, 1968. And the guests would include Dionne Warwick, who sung one of the Hal David Burt Bacharach songs, Say a Little Prayer, which was about somebody in Vietnam. Aretha Franklin, Martin Luther King, Senator Bobby Kennedy, Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, who was the first African-American to star in a situation comedy. Hazel Scott had her own show in 1950 on Dumont. Nipsey Russell, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, Bill Cosby, Buffy St. Marie, a ventriloquist named Aaron Williams, and Frida Babe. A remarkable week of prime time, well, it wasn't prime time, late night television with Harry Belafonte. And that would be the last political late night show until Jon Stewart in the 1990s. It would be a long time before you would see, although I'll say this, Merv Griffin tried to do this on CBS. He did a show, Mike Douglas did a show that was on in the afternoon. Merv goes to CBS in 1960, and his right-hand man is Dick Carson, Johnny Carson's brother. And he, too, gets into battles over guests with Paley, and he decides, you know what, I've had enough. I'll go back to what I was doing, where I have no boss. The report from Vietnam, that's February 27th, and it plays a major role in turning Americans against the war, according to the historian David Halberstam, and there may be Halberstand's books at the library, inducing Lyndon Johnson to abandon his re-election campaign. This is what's coming down to in 1968. Nixon looks like he's going to be the one that's going to be the Republican standard bearer. Johnson, he's an incumbent president. He should get the nomination. But Eugene McCarthy is challenging him on Vietnam. And George Wallace is around, but George Wallace is not running on the Democratic Party. He's running on a segregationist slate in the South. So you got those people involved as of February 27th. Johnson would win some primaries. Now, during my career, I covered the National Basketball Association, and the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, when I started covering them in 1980, 81, 82, was Lawrence O'Brien. And Lawrence O'Brien was in the Kennedy administration, part of that Boston Mafia that he had with Kenny O'Donnell and Powers and Pierre Salinger, those people. And O'Brien would go into the Johnson administration as his liaison to Congress. And I asked O'Brien, who knew Johnson quite well, I said, did Cronkite have Johnson, or did Johnson ever say, if I lost Cronkite, I've lost America? He said, I doubt it. I don't see why he would say that. Lyndon Johnson wouldn't buckle down to anybody. I can't see that happening, except there may be something here or there that might suggest otherwise. And I'll bring that up in a few minutes. And there is Lyndon Johnson. February 12th, 1968. Does that mean anything to you, February 12th, 1968, other than it was Lincoln's birthday in the North? The Memphis, Tennessee sanitation strike starts. It's a strike that would last until April 16th of 1968, and it would have a major, major, major historic importance during the civil rights movement. Bobby Kennedy gets into the race around March 17th. Richard Nixon is out in Oregon. He had just won the primary there, and he's told Bobby Kennedy is in the race, and he says, "Oh, I don't like those Kennedys. Oh, no, those Kennedys. Something strange happens all the time around them." Let me just say this about Richard. Let me say this about that. I got to know Richard Nixon in the mid-1980s, 1985 to be exact. He was appointed the arbitrator in the dispute between Major League Baseball owners and Major League Baseball umpires. And the first time I met him was in 1985 at his office down in Foley Square. And I got to see him quite a bit because I was covering sports in those days. And he used to hang around Shea Stadium, and he used to hang around the Yankee Stadium. So occasionally I would talk to him. He knew my name. He knew my first name, which I felt was a pretty good thing. And so I got to see him in action with other people. And he was a strange guy. Didn't have much of a personality, yet he became the president of the United States. March 17th, there's a demonstration in London against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And there was violence there. 91 people are injured, 200 demonstrators are arrested. It's on March 31st that Lyndon Johnson abandons his reelection campaign, telling the nation that he will not run for a second or full term as president of the United States. The United States is going to go through a really, really wicked 5-day period here, because on Johnson's announcement, March 31st, is the first day of 5 days, 2 major events in 5 days, and also after that, a lot of unrest in April, in May, and going out throughout the rest of the year. That's my wife. That is the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, a place I've been in twice, in 2004 and that time in 2015. Martin Luther King was in Memphis supporting the Memphis sanitation strike. On April 3rd, he gave the "I've been to the mountain" speech. And I watched that speech. I sat there, I watched it on 3 loops when I was inside the museum. And you walk among the people who walk through the South for civil rights, a wounded Vietnam veteran, a young African-American, an older African-American, a white in the back there. And you walk through this little exhibit, which takes you through all the marches that Martin Luther King was involved with in the South. And so he's in Memphis, and he's giving this talk on April 3rd, and you watch that talk, it's almost like "I've been to the mountain," and he's giving this talk as if he knows something is going to happen very shortly, and his time is done. Of course, his time is done on April 4th, 1968, shot in the balcony, or he was shot while he was standing on the balcony of a hotel in Memphis by James Earl Ray. That's where Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King are both buried. And I'm in front of that because I want to get that in the background. April 4th, Martin Luther King, it's 6:01 Central Time, shots ring out in Memphis, Tennessee, and he is literally dead by the time he hits the floor. April 4th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy is campaigning in Indianapolis, Indiana. And that was the days before this stuff, right? Cell phones. If you had a transistor radio with you, you might have been able to hear the news, but news didn't travel all that fast. Bobby Kennedy is at a campaign rally, and he addresses the crowd. And he tells the crowd that Martin Luther King has been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Bobby Kennedy is credited with quelling the violence that could have happened in Indianapolis with this paragraph. For those of you who are Black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people. I can only say that I feel in my heart the same kind of feeling. I have a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. Indianapolis did not have much in the way of demonstrations. Robert Kennedy was credited with helping that situation. And this guy here, the hardest working guy in showbiz, James Brown, of all people, is credited with keeping the lid on violence in Boston. It's the next day, and Kevin White was talking to James Brown. Should we or shouldn't we have your concert? Should we have your concert? Shouldn't we have your concert? James Brown says, we gotta go ahead with the concert. Gotta go ahead with the concert. Kevin White is skeptical. And James Brown says, I'll take care of it. I'll get my people to listen. Just let me perform. And he starts to perform. And there's a little bit of a rumble in the crowd. And James Brown stops. Wait a minute now, wait. Step down. Be a gentleman. Now I ask the police to step back because I think I could get some respect from my own people. Brown successfully restored order at the concert while keeping the police away from the crowd. And that is credited with keeping Boston from simmering in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King killing. That is Martin Luther King on the left, and on the right is Jackie Robinson. Major League Baseball, which was still amazingly popular in the United States in 1960s, 1968. Major League Baseball is struggling what to do in the aftermath of the killing of Martin Luther King. Should we play or shouldn't we play the day of the burial? And Spike Eckert, William Spike Eckert, the former general, is the commissioner of baseball. Not a very effective commissioner of baseball. And he leaves it up to the individual team owners. There are, at this point, 20 teams in Major League Baseball, which means there'll be 10 home games the day of Martin Luther King's burial. 9 of the owners said they're not playing. One of the owners, Jackie Robinson, of course, started his career with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He never went to Los Angeles. In fact, he didn't really end his career with the Brooklyn Dodgers because the Dodgers, with Walter O'Malley at the helm as the president and owner of the team, he didn't like Jackie Robinson. And he traded Jackie Robinson to the New York Giants for Don Littlefield. Robinson never played with the Giants. Instead, he became the vice president of Chock full of Nuts. Bill White is somebody I got to know when he was the Yankees announcer and then the president of the National League. I talked to him about this one day, and he said, we weren't playing. He said, the Philadelphia Phillies, we weren't playing. Philadelphia Phillies were supposed to play the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he said, this man gave up his life so I could have a better existence. He fought Jim Crow in the South. He fought prejudice. He gave up his life for people like me. I am not going to play baseball while he's being buried. O'Malley, though, he was persistent. The Dodgers were going to play baseball, but on the morning of April 9th, O'Malley met with his general manager, Buzzy Babese, and shortly thereafter announced the Dodgers' home opener would be postponed. It didn't matter. He would have won by forfeit because Bill White had enough support on his Philadelphia Phillies team, his Philadelphia Phillies teammates, that they weren't going to show up. They were not going to relent. They were not going to play. And O'Malley got the hint. He was the last of the owners to shut down the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. That is Washington, D.C. Looks like a war zone after the rioting that took place following the death of Martin Luther King. The greatest wave of social unrest in the United States immediately following the killing of Martin Luther King since the Civil War. Some of the biggest riots took place in Washington. You see the picture there, Baltimore. Chicago, where the mayor Richard Daley was determined not to see anything that might sully his city. Kansas City. Over the years, I've done this talk, and I could give you a lot of examples of what happened after the shooting and killing of King, but I'll limit it because we are a New York audience here, to a guy who was at CCNY. And he was there that night. Martin Luther King was shot at 7 o'clock at night, New York time. And he said the police came into to CCNY and they wanted to get the students out without any harm because they were afraid that there would be rioting right near CCNY. He said he got home fine, but there were a lot of tensions, an awful lot of tensions that never really did go away, but the violence was quelled somewhat after the burial of Martin Luther King. Through this all, Lyndon Johnson signed yet another Civil Rights Act in 1968 that was passed in April, which effectively prohibited housing discrimination based on race, which meant no more redlining, although some people decided to continue redlining afterwards. A level playing field for everybody in housing, supposedly, although that wasn't necessarily enforced right after the Civil Rights Act. Does the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? See, I got laughing in there. I got the laughing thing in there. April 23rd through 30th, Vietnam War. Mark Rudd, the head of the Students for Democratic Society, I actually met, I did this talk at Leicester Towers over in Whippany, New Jersey, and I met a woman who was best friends with Mark Rudd's mother. Mark Rudd, the head of SDS, and organizing protests at Columbia University, taking over administration buildings and shutting down the university. She said that Mark used to visit his parents over at Leicester Towers, and she was friends with Mrs. Rudd, who had passed away, and Mr. Rudd, who had passed away. And she said Mr. Rudd came in one day and was telling stories about his son. And he says, one day Mark Rudd calls his father and says, "We're taking over the U.S. Treasury building." And Mark Rudd's father said, "What do you want it for? Just leave it there. Find something else to do." Columbia University was shut down in 1968. Meanwhile, over in Europe, over in France, there is a general strike led by the socialists. Stop unconditional bombarding by the U.S. in North Vietnam. That was one of the planks, and there were all kinds of domestic planks that they wanted solved over in France. It was a socialist general strike. They organized it. There were demonstrations, massive general strikes, as well as occupation of university and factories. And Charles de Gaulle would cut a deal with the strikers for reforms. The deal was, we'll put up all these reforms. You vote for it in 1969. And wherever the chips fall, they fall. And if I lose, I quit. If I win, we get the reforms. To make a long story short, de Gaulle failed, quit. The reforms never passed. Now, this is June 1968, the Ambassador Hotel. And before I started here, I talked about Boston's North End and my friend Shelley Saltman, who went to school with Barbara Walters and didn't go to school with Leonard Bernstein or David Susskind because they were older than he was. He went to school with his best friend growing up, Lenny Nimoy, Barbara Walters, and behind him were people like Sheldon Adelson, who his brother was friends with Sheldon Adelson growing up. Shelley was a promoter in 1968, and he was a manager of musical acts. One of the musical acts was Andy Williams. He also organized the Andy Williams San Diego PGA golf stop, and Andy and Shelley became quite close. And Shelley was telling me the story that Andy's best friend was Bobby Kennedy in those days. And the morning of the California primary, Andy calls up Shelley, and he says, "Hey, Shelley, I have a favor to ask." And Shelley said, "Well, what do you need?" And he says, "Well, Bobby's in town, and I'm with Bobby, and we need a place where Bobby could go and hide out for 3-4 hours, has to write a couple speeches. If he wins tonight, or if he loses tonight, have any place for you to go, or for us to go?" And Shelley says, "Well, I'm going to Denver, but go to my office. My secretary knows you. She'll let you in with Bobby and relax, and whatever you need, she'll get for you." And so Bobby wrote the last 2 speeches of his life at Shelley's desk. And Shelley grew up in Boston, and he played football with Ted Kennedy. They went to high school or knew each other from junior high school and high school. So he knew Teddy quite well. He didn't really know Bobby because Bobby was 8 years older. And he knew Jack a little bit, very little, because Shelley's father, well, he got the Jewish vote out for the Kennedys in the North End. And Tip O'Neill, all those people. So Bobby's writing his final 2 speeches at his desk. He goes to the Ambassador Hotel. He wins the California primary. And of course, the history mysteries. The question here is, had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated, would he have been the Democratic nominee, and would he have beaten Richard Nixon? Hold off on your answers until after I get through the Democratic National Convention, because I have some stuff that might sway you one way or the other after I hear, or you can put it into chat. I'm not going to look at it right now, whether or not Bobby Kennedy would have gotten the Democratic nod or not, or become president or not in 1968. So Kennedy is at the Ambassador Hotel, and I've covered these political things. Candidates never walk through a crowd. They always go through a back room to get out of a room. And waiting for him is Sirhan. Bobby Kennedy was protected by Rosie Greer and Rayford Johnson, the Olympian. I interviewed Rosie Greer about 16, 17 years after this. Rosie Greer was a professional football player with the New York Giants and then the Los Angeles Rams, member of the fearsome foursome defensive line of the Rams. 6'5", about 320 pounds. Rayford also a really big guy. Shelley told me that Bobby Kennedy couldn't be more than 5'6" or 5'7" on his best days in his stocking feet. And those 2 guys, being massive men, should have been able to guard Bobby Kennedy. And they went through California with him the week prior to the primary. So they go through the pantry into the kitchen. Sirhan somehow is there waiting, and he shoots Bobby Kennedy. And I asked Rosie Greer, now the background of this is Rosie Greer was putting out a book about knitting, because that's what he did. He knitted sweaters and all this other stuff. And when you're a reporter, sometimes to get to what you want to get to, you have to ask questions about what they're selling. It's an old trick. It works. So I asked him about knitting, and then I said, well, let me ask you a question. Let's go back to June of 1968. How did you have, what possessed you to knock the gun out of Sirhan's hand? Because Rosie Greer, I think I froze here. Hang on one second here. Let me stop the video and start the video again. There we go. Occasional Zoom screw up. Anyway, so I'm talking to Rosie Greer, and I said, what possessed you to act the way you did? He didn't know. He said it was just a reaction. He didn't have time to think about it. He just went, knocked the gun out, broke Sirhan's arm along the way. And Rosie, over the years, and I've spoken to people, I haven't seen Rosie in about 35 years, but over the years, I've talked to people, and they said that he was haunted by the fact that he did not do his job, which was to make sure Bobby Kennedy wasn't hurt. And for whatever reason, wherever he was the bodyguard. But John Kennedy once told Larry O'Brien on the morning that he was killed, and they're walking on the top of the hotel in Fort Worth, and he's looking around, and he says, you know, Larry, this is a great, great big world out there. If they want to get me, they're going to get me. Larry O'Brien told that to my friend Mark Schneider, who worked at the Associated Press. Didn't really tell other people that as well. They got Bobby Kennedy. Of course, the question that will never be answered is, what if? What if he's not shot? What if he's not killed? How would the United States have looked with Bobby Kennedy? So I'll talk about that a bit later. This is Prague, Czechoslovakia. And I was on a cruise ship in May of 2018 doing this talk, and there was a woman in a walker. I'm sitting in one of the side lounges with about 200 seats, and there's a woman in a walker right in front of me, about 6 feet in front of me, and I put up this picture, and she said, oh, it was beautiful. You were there? Yeah, I was there. I said, what was so beautiful? And I said, before you go on, I'm going to sit down and talk to this woman, who was from Chicago, I found out. And I'm a reporter, basically. That's my job as a journalist. I'm going to interview her. And you're welcome to eavesdrop and listen. And if the cruise director comes in, just say, hey, the speaker is tired and needed a couple minutes rest. I did ask the woman, I said, it was so beautiful. Why was it so beautiful? She said, we weren't looking over our shoulders. We weren't looking over our shoulders. We'd go out to eat at cafes. The musicians could play. The poets could read their poetry. It was beautiful. We could get around. We didn't feel like we had the boot on our neck. And so they have a summer, the Prague Spring. It starts actually in January of that year. And they have a summer to look forward to. It is August 20th, and I'm still talking to this woman. And I said, so what happened? And she says, well, I'm in my house in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. And it's about 11 o'clock at night, and I'm living with my mother. Let me give you some background on this woman. This woman was a Holocaust survivor. Raul Wallenberg saved her and her mother. First time I ever met somebody who was saved by the Swedish diplomat who wrote out, who got people out of harm like this woman. And she says, Mama calls me and she says, what are airplanes flying over Bratislava, Czechoslovakia on August 20th at 11 o'clock at night? And then she looks out the window and she sees the tanks, and they know it's over. The Soviets and the Warsaw Pact countries, but mostly the Soviets, put the boot down to the neck of the Czechoslovakians. The odd thing she told me was that she actually felt sorry for the Soviet troops. A lot of them were young. They had to stand their post. They couldn't get, say, I don't know, water from somebody, because if they did and they took it, they were going to be shot on the spot by the Soviet army or whatever. And she said, so she actually felt sorry for them. Make a long story short about this woman, she still had a visa, and they had planned to go to Brussels, Belgium for a vacation after the Jewish holidays in October of that year. They pack up, they go to Brussels, but instead of going to a hotel, they go right to the American embassy, her and her mother. They have a sponsor in Chicago, and they ask for asylum. 72 hours later, they start their new lives in Chicago, leaving behind the Soviet boot on the neck of the Czechoslovakians. The Prague Spring began on January 5th of 1968. Alexander Dubček was elected first secretary of the Communist Party. The spring would end officially in the West August 21st, back in Czechoslovakia, August 20th. And Dubček would stay on until April of 1969. And eventually, he was killed in a rather suspicious automobile accident. Pol Pot, Cambodia, the killing fields. He comes to power in 1968. The Khmer Rouge officially formed, its forces launched, and there's an insurgency across Cambodia. And Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam provided shelter and weapons to the Khmer Rouge. The Beatles. Beatles put out a song called Revolution by John Lennon. The song actually doesn't really go anywhere. It's kind of a mumble jumble of words if you really listen to it and try to pick it apart. But the song is important because it's the Beatles putting out a song about what's going on in the world. A revolution is going on in the world, and other rockers decide they can join the Beatles. If they can talk about it, we could talk about it. And I have a friend by the name of Rich Lee. He's a professor at St. Bonaventure's University. And he does actually a talk called Was Rock Music the Soundtrack of Global Protests in the late 60s and early 1970s? And we talked about how did people get information from rock music. But it wasn't just rock music. The rock musicians just replaced the folkies like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Tom Paxton, who were complaining about the war, and Country Joe and the Fish, and Pete Seeger and Peter, Paul, and Mary. They had been doing it for a long time. Dylan since 1963, anti-Vietnam. What the Beatles did was allow the cultural protest to merge with the political demonstrators, and that would manifest itself with the song Give Peace a Chance, which Lenin wrote in May of 1969 and was sung after that at many, many anti-war demonstrations around the United States. I won, I won. Richard Nixon is the Republican nominee for president. And that's Gerald Ford with that smile on his face, as if he's saying, you know, I know something you don't know. 6 years later, Ford would become president. Behind him is George Romney, the Michigan governor. So Nixon's the one. Nixon's the one. And there's Pegasus. Pegasus is running for president. And he's got his wife, and he's got the piglets, and he's being arrested by policemen from the Chicago Police Department. Pegasus the pig is arrested. We don't know what happened to Pegasus. Among the stories, he was had for dinner at the police department, or he went out to Iowa and lived out his life on a farm in Iowa. Political theater, that's what it was. The Yippies, remember the Yippies, the Youth International Party? They nominated Pegasus the pig for president. That was August 23rd. Pegasus was arrested, along with Jerry Rubin and others, disorderly conduct. Hubert Humphrey is the nominee. McCarthy doesn't have really any support, or he has little support. Bobby Kennedy is dead. George Wallace is doing what George Wallace is doing in the South. And Hubert Humphrey is the vice president. And he steps in for Lyndon Johnson after Johnson says, we're done. Humphrey has the unity part on that button. Now, here's the question that you might want to answer now, and you can put it in chat. Had Bobby Kennedy lived, would he have been the Democratic nominee? And if you put that in, I'll wait 10 seconds to see if anybody will put it in, and I'll give you my theory on it, my best guess theory on that, from people I talked to who were around in 1968, like Lawrence O'Brien. So I'll wait a minute if anybody has anything to write about that, about Bobby Kennedy, yes or no. I'll just wait a second or two. Okay, I'll give you 10 more seconds here, and nobody's in chat. Okay, so let's talk about Bobby Kennedy, and let's talk about Hubert Humphrey and Chicago. You got to remember, Lyndon Johnson hated John Kennedy, and John Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson. The apparatus at this point in 1968 was Humphrey was using Johnson's people, and Kennedy really did not build up a support staff. Yeah, he had Jerry Springer. He was one of the guys that was part of the Bobby Kennedy campaign. He had Jeff Greenfield as well, who ended up being with ABC News. He had a lot of young guys. They were young guys at that time. They were guys in their 20s that hooked on to Kennedy's campaign. But Kennedy got in too late. You can't build a structure when you get into the campaign in March on St. Patrick's Day, and there's the incumbent president running for re-election, Lyndon Johnson. You got to have access to money and access to workers. He had access to neither, which is why he ended up with young guys like Jerry Springer and Jeff Greenfield and a whole bunch of others. Bob Arum, the boxing promoter, was another guy who was part of the Kennedy campaign. I've been told over the years by people who were around in those days that Kennedy was really priming himself up for a 1972 run. He didn't think he was going to win in 1968. He thought Nixon stood a good chance of winning in 1968, and he was going to take on Nixon in 1972, or maybe Hubert Humphrey if he won. But there was no real expectation that Kennedy was going to win unless there was a backroom deal brokered by the Johnson people with the Kennedy people. But we'll never know. We'll never know because Kennedy is killed, and it's one of history's mysteries. Humphrey gets the nomination and doesn't break with Lyndon Johnson's policies, particularly on Vietnam. He's in step with the Great Society, with the Civil Rights Act, among other things, even with the Civil Rights Movement, even though he was not vice president when that came about. Meanwhile, in Chicago, there were protests in the streets of Chicago outside the convention. The Vietnam War, the significant issue. Getting back to that cruise that I was on in March of 2018, aside from that woman, there was another woman who was there, and she was a woman who was in her 70s, and she was telling me that she happened to be staying, for whatever reason, at the Conrad Hilton Hotel, where all the action is taking place in front of that hotel. And she's in one of the upper floors, and she opens the window, and she said, you could hear them downstairs yelling, the world is watching, the world is watching, the world is watching. And she said that when she looked at it, it was two opposing teams ready to go at each other. The Chicago cops, Richard Daley's Chicago cops, remember he told the police in Chicago after the King killing, any demonstrators, rioters, shoot to kill, because he did not want his city sullied in any way. And then you had the protesters, and they were ready to rumble. And that's what she said. There was another guy on that trip. He was 16 years old at the time. And I looked at him. I said, you were the Ham's Beer guy. He said, how did you know? I said, just looking at you, I could tell you were the Ham's Beer guy. I said, yeah, I was upset. We couldn't play baseball in Grant Park because of all the demonstrators and everything else that was going on. I said, you sound like you were the underage, under 21-year-old Ham's drinker. And this is what the woman saw from above, looking down, bring the troops home now, ceasefire now, as they are getting ready to rumble. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin had vowed to lead Vietnam protesters to Chicago to disrupt the convention. Meanwhile, Richard Daley is becoming more and more paranoid, mayor of Chicago, because he hears a rumor that Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and others plan to dump all kind of LSD into the water supply, which is in Lake Michigan for Chicago. And he's getting worried that he's going to have a whole bunch of acid heads walking through Chicago, or a whole bunch of Groucho Marx. Groucho was one of the first people in the United States ever to drop LSD. So he's worried that all of a sudden the water supply is going to be polluted by LSD, and he's becoming more and more paranoid with what's going on because he doesn't want to see anything in his city. Daley made it clear he would block any attempt to disrupt the convention or sully the city's name. Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin never did get down to the meatpacking plant area. That's where the amphitheater was, where the convention was. And but they were outside of it. Meanwhile, inside is Mike Wallace and Gunga Dan. Gunga Dan. That was his nickname around CBS. And they were roughed up by some of the delegates for asking questions, I suppose. And we have Walter Cronkite, who's on the air. And Walter Cronkite is an old-time news guy. He's not one of these guys that you see on cable TV news today, nor is he a guy that, and I've been on their shows on MSNBC and also ABC News Now, and what they tell you is make good TV. Don't worry about your facts, right or wrong. Just make good, exciting TV so people will watch. That wasn't the case in 1968. This is what Cronkite said, watching Mike Wallace and Dan Rather getting pummeled and pulled out of the arena. I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, if I may be permitted to say so. He's asking you, can I say this, or are you going to be upset at me if I say that? But that was part of the Chicago Convention at that point. It's August the 28th, and the cameramen are on the street, and they have their cameras looking at the crowd. The young people are chanting, the whole world is watching, and then the rumble starts. The Chicago Tribune, which was at one time owned by Colonel McCormick, who was a member of America First, the America First Committee, and a very conservative newspaper, hardly a liberal bastion, but in 1968, they put out a story about what was going on at the convention. Many convention visitors were appalled at what they considered unnatural enthusiasm of police for the job of arresting demonstrators. And there he is, there's Dick Daley, and Dick Daley at this point has had enough. Abraham Riverkoff, the senator from Connecticut, is giving a talk, and he talks about the tactics the Chicago Police Department is pulling, and he calls them Gestapo tactics, and Daley had enough. He gives the cutthroat sign to Riverkoff, get off there, I don't want to hear the rest of your speech, you're sullying my city. Daley did everything he could to curtail the voices speaking out against the Vietnam War. He was backing Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey in keeping this war going. Rubikoff went on and finished his speech. Humphrey is the one. He goes against Nixon and George Wallace as well. There were some demonstrators arrested. The Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7 eventually. And the Chicago 8 were Abbie Hoffman, Tom Hayden, David Dellinger, Rennie Davis, John Freundes, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, no relation to me, and Bobby Seale. Eventually, Seale would be sent to would be cut off from the other 7, and it would become the Chicago 7, and he would stand trial on other charges. By February of 1970, there were 5 of the Chicago conspirators that were convicted with the intent to incite a riot while crossing state lines. They were convicted in February 1970. That was overturned in 1971. 2 of them were acquitted. Prior to that, the convictions were eventually reversed on appeal. Meanwhile, there is another group that's looking for rights, and they are women. And the women's movement probably started with the book, which I'm sure is in the library, The Female Mystique by Betty Friedan. That was released in 1963. Betty Friedan initially wrote an article about her classmates at Smith University and how most of them were very, very dissatisfied with the way their lives turned out. She couldn't sell the article, so she decided to write a book instead. And the book came out in 1963, and by 1966, the National Organization of Women was founded. And these are radical women, or so they said. They were radical women. On August 22nd, the New York radical women invited women of every political persuasion to the Atlantic City Boardwalk. September 7th, the day of the Miss America contest. They would protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us. Their catchphrase, or maybe not their catchphrase, but they were into, quote unquote, burning their bras. And I did this talk 2 years ago at a senior residence in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I asked the crowd there, and they were mostly in their 70s, any of you burn your bra? And one woman looks at me and she says, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy? Do you know how much it costs to get one and then to find one comfortable enough? You think I'm stupid enough to do that?" I was with them. I wasn't going to burn my bra. It cost a lot of money. And another woman said, "Look at me. Do I need one?" And then there was another woman who was 83, and she just looked at me and said, "Does it really matter anymore?" But the burn your bra image became a big thing because men got involved because they're not thinking on the same lines as women. But hey, let's look in to see what's going on here. The protest would feature a freedom trash can into which women could throw away all the physical manifestations of women's oppression, such as bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and issues of Cosmopolitan, Helen Gurley Brown's Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and Family Circle. There is the Freedom Trash Can. They're throwing some of their items in there. And take a look behind the radio reporter, the reporter who is with ABC, who is carrying her microphone. Look to her left, you're right on the screen. There is a woman who is wearing her bra on the outside of her dress. These women were really serious in burning their bras to get attention to the movement, and it worked. The 1968 protest didn't change the Miss America pageant. Burt Parks was still there singing, "There she is, Miss America." But what they did was they introduced feminism into mainstream consciousness and expand the national conversation about women's rights and the liberation of women, which included abortion on demand, educational opportunity, and daycare for all. Why is that man laughing? He's laughing because he's on Rowan and Martin's Laughing. Dick Nixon, and he preferred you call him Dick when you got to know him. Please call me Dick. Dick Nixon. He's on Rowan and Martin's Laughing, and he changes again how to run for president. 1960, he's debating against Kennedy. Kennedy looks great. Nixon has a 5 o'clock shadow. He's got a knee injury. He can barely stand up. He looks like he was on the IRT on July 23rd in the afternoon, packed in like a sardine in a can, and in a subway that's not air conditioned, that's 96 degrees with 142% humidity. Visually, he looks like a wreck. Kennedy, though, looks like the son of a Hollywood studio owner. They match his shirt, black and white. They match his shirt to the background. He looks cool, calm, and collected, while Nixon looks like a harried commuter. And Kennedy won that debate on style points because of what he looked like, which is amazing. But Nixon helps change presidential debates to where do they look presidential? 1968, he changes it again by uttering these words, "Sock it to me?" He's on there showing a sense of humor, which he didn't really have. He wasn't really a people person, but he showed a sense of humor. Sock it to me. Hubert Humphrey was invited on the show to do the same thing, and he felt it was beneath his dignity. But Nixon doing that allows Bill Clinton to play the clarinet on Arsenio Hall. He allows Arnold Schwarzenegger to go on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno to announce that he's running for governor of California, allows other people to announce that they're running for president on late night shows. That was what Richard Nixon did, maybe inadvertently, but that's what happened. Meanwhile, the Smothers Brothers are in trouble. They are told that they have to tape their shows and have that tape in 10 days in advance of the air date, so the censors could thoroughly vet them. And I do this part of my 1969 talk because TV, the way TV works, the year is September to June, something like that, but I throw it into 69 talk. The first show was Harry Belafonte, and he is singing a song on the show. It's about a 4.5-minute segment, and he is cut out of the show, as is Jackie Mason, who told a joke about children playing doctor, as is... there are other things that happened on the show. Actually, Jackie Mason, that was March 9th, 1969. The thing that was cut out of that show was they were going up against Bonanza, 2 lines about Bonanza. I don't know, maybe Haas didn't like Hop Sings cooking. They complained about it. They cut it out. Belafonte was supposed to be on the show. They cut him out. And instead of him being on the show, they run 4.5 minutes of Richard Nixon campaign advertising. They make money off of that on the Smothersburg show, which made no sense because people who were not going to vote, people who were going to vote for Nixon were not going to watch the Smothers Brothers show. Pat Paulson comes on. He's running for president, first comedian to run for president. And he's giving his platform as well on that show. I remember sending away for those editorials, and over the years they've been lost. But Pat Paulson did satire and then could speak out of both sides of his mouth. Deadpan, double talk, comments on the issues of the day. Jose Feliciano, he was picked by Ernie Harwell. If anybody here is a baseball fan, they know all about Ernie Harwell, the legendary Detroit Tiger radio and television play-by-play announcer who happened to be a musician on the side. And he saw Jose Feliciano earlier and recommended that he sings the national anthem before Game 5 of the St. Louis Cardinals Detroit Tigers World Series game, October 7th, 1968. This is kind of an unusual picture in that here you got the young Feliciano. He has longish hair with a guitar, and he looks like he's being accompanied by people who would play at the VFW Square Dance fundraiser. Just like that, it's just the position of that. Jose Feliciano, at this point, nobody knows that the question on that, how old you had to be to vote in 1968? 21. That would be changed in 1972 because so many people were in Vietnam, and 18-year-olds felt that they were not represented, that they had to run to Vietnam if drafted, that the Nixon administration decided to let 18-year-olds vote. Anyway, getting back to Feliciano. Feliciano is an American from Puerto Rico. He's blind. He does have long hair. You can't see his guide dog there. And there were objections to a foreigner playing the national anthem with long hair, disrespecting the flag because he was wearing sunglasses, playing guitar, looking like a so-called hippie. He sings the lyrics to Star Spangled Banner to a new tune. The tune would be a Latin jazz twist, Caribbean jazz twist. The audience both cheered him and booed him. The game was on NBC. The switchboard at NBC, when they used to have switchboards, was inundated by callers, as was the Tiger Stadium switchboard, because they felt that Jose Feliciano's version of the national anthem was unpatriotic. 50 years later, in 2018, Jose Feliciano did the national anthem, and it was with a Latin twist, and nobody cared. Mexico, there's problems in Mexico leading up to the Mexico City 1968 Olympics. There was a group called CNH, made up of students from 70 universities and preparatory schools, and they were the ones who coordinated protests. What they were protesting in Mexico, they wanted social, educational, and political reforms. They're in the main square of Mexico City, October 2nd, and they're reading speeches and they're protesting. There are about 10,000 high school and university students there, and they're protesting the government and listening to speeches when all of a sudden the Mexican army surrounds them. It's about 5:55 in the evening, red flares are shot. 6:15, another 2 flares are shot, this time from a helicopter. 5,000 soldiers come in, 200 tanks, they surround the plaza, many died, many were arrested, and the official story, which still is sort of the official story, because there have been inquiries over the years where they've gotten some of the story right, but the official story was the army had to come in because they got intelligence that the student demonstrators were about ready to turn on each other, and they were going to get into fights with one another, and the soldiers were sent there to protect the students from turning on one another. That's their official story. Meanwhile, the Mexico City Olympics would start a couple of weeks later. That is Tommy Smith in the middle. John Carlos is on your right, complete with beads around his neck, which signifies lynching. And on the left side and on Smith's right side is Peter Norman. Peter Norman is the Australian. This is the this is the dash, 100 meters dash, which Tommy Smith would win. Norman would come in second, silver medal, and Carlos would win the bronze medal. Now, if you take a look at the uniforms or the sweats of the teams, you'll see a patch. There's a little patch to on Carlos's number 9, right above number 9 USA. There's a patch. That's the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Tommy Smith's got it above the U in the USA, and Peter Norman had to borrow it from somebody else so he could put on while he's up at the podium winning the silver medal. Peter Norman fared the worst of the 3. Peter Norman suggested to Carlos and Smith, Smith's wearing gloves, split the gloves so they could each have a glove. What you don't see are Smith and Carlos with bare feet, signifying poverty. I told you that Norman was the one who suffered the most out of this. The Olympic Project for Human Rights. Norman goes home to Australia and becomes a non-citizen, literally becomes a non-citizen. In the case of Smith, he goes to play professional football in the American Football League, which had merged with the National Football League in 1969. And hang on, somebody wants to come in. Okay, in 1969, he plays with the Cincinnati Bengals. John Carlos would be drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles. He had a knee injury that would not allow him to play with the Eagles. He did play 1 year with Montreal in the Canadian Football League. Both Smith and Carlos ended up becoming educators, and they did okay for themselves. They didn't really have any problems. However, Norman, that was a problem. In 1972, he qualified for the Australian Olympic team, and he was denied a spot. Why? He was part of the protest. It would not be until 2012, 6 years after his death, that the Australian Parliament apologized to him for the way the country treated him after the Olympics. Smith and Carlos, who are not particularly close, were pallbearers at his funeral. Like I said, Smith and Carlos, they kept the medals. They were thrown out of the Olympic Village. They did not have to give their medals back. And they have spoken about that over the years. Smith said, you know what? It was a peaceful protest. We didn't bother anybody. It was just a protest. That's what he said on the 50th anniversary of what happened a couple of years ago. Nixon would win. He wins the election. Hubert Humphrey, the loser. George Wallace takes electoral votes away in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana. And nothing ever changes. Ottawa worried Nixon's policy could hit us in the pocketbook. NAFTA, all these treaties, economic treaties that have been negotiated over the years. But Nixon wins. Nixon's the one. There was some sort of debate prior to Election Day of 1968, whether or not Nixon and the widow of Claire Chennault, the Flying Tigers, went over the Burma hump. I have to thank my 9th grade teacher, Stewie Gates, who hammered that into us, about Claire Chennault going over the Burma hump during World War II with their planes. Anyway, there have been some stories that Nixon was out there with Claire Chennault's wife and talking to the North Vietnamese and saying, don't talk to Johnson, talk to us, we win, we'll give you a better deal than Lyndon Johnson, but nothing other than some conjecture came out of that. Why'd Humphrey lose? Well, the theory is he would not break with Johnson on the course of the Vietnam War. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Elvis is back. December 3rd, 1968, NBC finally gets around to putting the Elvis comeback special on TV. It was shot in June during the summer of 1968. Elvis puts back on the leather, he straps on the guitar, and he has a good old time for 2.5, 3 hours playing all the old songs, and that launches him into his career as a Las Vegas crooner. Does it my way. And he gives up the movies. Those movies, some of them are just so awful, including the movie that he was in with Bill Bixby, where there were a pair of race car drivers who owe money to the IRS. Mr. Mooney from the Here's Lucy show, Gail Gordon, is running the IRS office, and they're going back and forth, and then Elvis breaks into a song. I think it's called something like, he's not your uncle, he's Sam, and it's an anti-IRS song. He got out of there and went to Las Vegas and revitalized his career until he passed away 9 years later. So the Elvis comeback special, December 3rd. And we end the year with Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell in Apollo 8. And I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull. Dick Hull worked for NASA between, say, 1960 and 1975, and then worked for the Goddard Space Age, the Goddard in Greenblatt, Maryland, the Goddard branch of NASA. And he was telling me that this flight, Apollo 8, which went around the moon, Christmas Eve, got more mail than when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon in July of 1969. Borman, Anders, and Lovell, there's a picture that they sent showing the Earth rise, and they read passages from the Bible, from Genesis, as they're going around the moon on Christmas Eve, basically saying the Earth is good. Don't mess with it. It's a good place. It's the only place that we have. And as I said, Dick told me that in terms of volume of mail, that was the biggest batch of mail that they ever got after the three of them circled the moon. The problems in 1968 don't end on December 31st, 1968. They would continue into 1969, 1970, 1971. 1968 would shape generations to come. Richard Nixon would inherit a whole bunch of problems in 1969. Well, I want to thank everybody. Let's thank Tara for inviting me. I see that we kind of froze again. Let me unfreeze myself. and get the video going again. And if you have any questions or any comments, feel free. I always like hearing comments and questions, and you can unmute yourself as well. From Shelley Weiner, are we related, Shelley? I don't know if we're related or not. That's a common name, actually. Shelley Weiner Flannery, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you,
Oh,
Shelley.
I pronounced it wrong.
I appreciate that. Steve, kudos and thanks. Thank you for being here tonight. Anybody who is not in chat who might want to say anything, the floor is yours now, because this is only the third one I've done today, and my voice is kind of shot. Anybody have anything to add about from that era? Floor is yours. Don't be shy, because I'm not. Anybody? Well, if nobody has anything, I'm going to wrap this up, and thank you for attending tonight. I hope that, let me ask you a question before I go here, and you don't have to answer it. How many of you were demonstrators during that time?
None. No.
No?
Observers.
Hank, you were a demonstrator?
Sure was.
You were a demonstrator. Where'd you demonstrate?
DC.
You were down there in 69 at the big one?
Not at the big one.
Oh, okay. So did you feel safe demonstrating?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Anybody else who was demonstrators during that time?
No.
No? You sat back and watched.
Yeah.
How many of you were students at that time?
Yes.
Yeah, we were.
Yep.
Yeah. What was college campus like at that time?
We had protests at Queens College.
I heard of, you bring up Queens College. I did this talk at the Ambassador, which is a
Remember I tried to get a dog. I thought the puppy name would let me.
yeah, I did this talk at the
Because
Ambassador.
they thought they were going to kill the dog in protest.
And there was this
What do you mean you
woman
won't let us?
who was talking about, she went to Queens College, and she said that the year she graduated Queens College, which was 1968, and she was crying during this because her husband became a cop. And she was talking about he was called pig and everything else. And she had kept it in for a long, long time, and she let it out. She started to cry. I said, "You're okay?" She said, "No, I needed you. I have held this in for years and years and years. My husband wasn't a pig. He was a great provider for our children. He was a cop. He was a good man." But she was telling me she graduated Queens College. And she said the day of her graduation in the big auditorium in Queens College, somebody rolled in a casket. And the casket went between the penultimate and the ultimate people getting their diplomas, and the chancellor, president of the school, did not want the casket in there, but let it go because he didn't want to create any other problems. And she said everybody is getting their envelope with their diploma, and the last guy there opens up the casket, says, "Throw it in there. That's for the one that's going to be out of this class killed at a worthless war." And that was the protest in 1968 at Queens College, whoever went to Queens College. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll see you down the road. And I have a lot of other talks that are coming up all over the place. And just, if you want, just check out my website, and you will see where I am. Thank you, Tara, for inviting me to the library, and thank every one of you for coming here tonight. And,
What is your website?
Just look up my name. Look up Evan Weiner speech, Evan Weiner talks, just look it up, and you'll find it, along with a lot of other things about me, probably some of which you probably shouldn't know. But it's all up there, you know, Google, Yahoo, the whole bit. So anyway, thank you so much for attending tonight. Thank you to the library, the Somers Library. Thank you to Tara. And hopefully we'll see you down the road. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.